it's huge. A $50 million hit a day is significant. I think, when we step back and we look at what it's doing to the economy, it's obviously disrupting a war machine. And when you consider that Russia is on a war footing, its overall economy has been re-engineered, if you will, to prosecute the war, not just in Ukraine, but ultimately to prepare for a potential conflict against NATO. That kind of disruption is significant. You've seen estimates that 17 to 18% of their oil and energy capacity has been affected, diluted, if you will. And just, it's increasing, right? The drone warfare that Ukraine is able to do, and John can speak a little bit better to that, is having a significant effect because the reach is getting deeper. I quickly noted that there were strikes just this last couple of days, in the central part of Russia, hitting a Gazprom facility. That's significant when you'll be able to travel 1,400 kilometers. You're hitting things north and south of Moscow. So the impact is going to be real, and it's going to be felt both on the battlefield, but also domestically, because the last point I'll make here is that since June, and in large part because of these oil and energy attacks by Ukraine, consumer prices in Russia has skyrocketed by 40% in terms of increasing. So that's a lot of pain.
Also, Russia's oil pipeline monopoly Transneft has warned producers that they may have to cut output following Ukraine's drone attacks on Russia's oil refining capacity, critical export ports, and other refineries, three industry sources told Reuters. Could this force Putin to change his thinking, or just to at least to begin to realize that something is going wrong with his strategy and his rule?
Yeah, Daniel, I would hope that it would, but I think what we're seeing on the battlefield, and again, this is something that John can address, is that Putin doesn't see it that same way. Now, he may be fooling himself. The domestic pressures may be too great. But when you look at certain resignations that we're seeing in the Russian government, you're seeing the softliners go. The hardliners are remaining. In my opinion, Russia remains fully committed to this, probably for all the wrong reasons. They shouldn't be doing this as a military. They've hit a brick wall in terms of Ukraine. It's a static battlefront for the most part along the battlefields. But Putin doesn't show any signs of backing down. And for him, it's not personal. He doesn't care that Russian civilians are suffering domestically as prices skyrocketing. He doesn't care that 1.1 million now Russian soldiers, along with a few allies from China and from North Korea, have been killed or wounded on the battlefields of Ukraine. And so from that standpoint, Ukraine is smart to keep doing it because it ultimately affects this war machine. But I don't know that it changes Putin's calculus, unfortunately, anytime soon.
In the recent statement, President Putin warned that Russia will respond to what he calls strategic threat from the West with military technical measures, while also claiming the foundation of nuclear dialogue have been undermined. Mark, do you see this as a real preparation for escalation or mostly blackmail aimed at dividing the West?
Right. And, as I looked into this and examined what Putin was trying to accomplish here, I think what we're seeing is it's posturing, it's a negotiating position that he's taking. It's kind of ironic that he says, look, we're not going to talk with rhetoric when that's what happens daily out of Moscow with, Russian-controlled state media in doing that. But there are some real-world implications here. And I think he's dangling a carrot with these START talks, his willingness to, and that's the nuclear anti-proliferation treaty between the U.S. and Russia. He's willing to give a year's delay and keep that going. But I think there's also a real threat behind that, a military threat, because if that goes away and Russia starts forward positioning their nukes, then NATO has to respond. Response times go down. Those forces are closer, and that creates a real consequence in terms of NATO. And I'm sure John can touch on that as well.
Colonel Sweet, when Putin talks about military technical measures, what could that actually mean on the ground on Ukraine or even in NATO?
Yeah, so I'll go back a little bit to what Mark was talking about. This is in one measure. This is Putin trying to demonstrate strength, okay? And his strength lies in his strategic abilities, okay? Strategic abilities with strategic nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons. He doesn't have a conventional threat against NATO. And he's losing the conventional war against Ukraine, so he has to fall back on other measures. He wants to project strength through nuclear type of weapons and using that as threats to the West. Okay, so, but what he also needs to remember is that the West too has nuclear weapons. NATO is nuclear capable. The United States is nuclear capable. I don't think that he'll employ nuclear weapons. He keeps falling back on using nuclear weapons as a measure to potentially escalate the situation to try to get NATO to fall back. NATO doesn't present an offensive threat to Russia. And I think what he's looking for is an offensive threat against him so he can convince the Russian people that they need to mobilize to fight. He's losing in Ukraine. He's trying to pick a fight in NATO. NATO is not going to bite. NATO is going to defend their terrain. And when those aircraft and helicopters and drones cross the border, they'll be shot down, but they won't be shot down over Russian territory. And that is what he's looking for.
Also, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has decided that military escalation is the best way for him to force Ukraine to surrender on his terms, and he came to believe that Trump won't take any serious actions to support Ukraine after this summit in Alaska, according to Bloomberg sources. Mark, do you feel that Vladimir Putin is being emboldened by Trump's hesitation to act and also by this shameful summit in Alaska?
Right. I think if we connect the dots, Daniel, everything that Putin has done since he visited with President Trump in Anchorage in Alaska has shown that he's interpreted as a green light, that he feels that Trump is either going to be focused on the Western Hemisphere or focused on China, but anything but focused on him. And so from that standpoint, it's clear that he walked away encouraged. I would also point out, though, that I think Putin is encouraged on the other side of the world as well. When he went to participate in Beijing's 80th celebration of its victory over World War II, he was encouraged there by what he saw as well. There was unity. And China is sitting there by the sidelines as well saying, hey, this is a huge reason why John and I decided to start this Substack this day is to warn about this. This is not just about Putin and his war against Ukraine and potentially his machinations against Eastern Europe. It's also what China thinks that they can now get out of this in the Indo-Pacific. It's becoming much more global in that regard. And so from that standpoint, I think we need to pay attention to what China did while Russia was there, which is to put out a paper that was called the Global Governance Security Agreement. They're basically issuing their own competing version of the Atlantic Charter that Winston Churchill and Roosevelt did in 1941 off Newfoundland and Canada. And so I think there's a lot to be concerned here. I think Putin sees it as a green light, and I think Beijing sees it as a green light as well.
Also, Vladimir Putin on Friday signed a decree accepting the resignation of his longtime aide Dmitry Kozak. Kozak, according to the Washington Post, was the only senior official to voice opposition to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Mark, is Vladimir Putin now fully allying himself with so-called Russia's hardliners and take their side to continue this war against Ukraine?
Right, Daniel, I think if I had a headline for this, it's just clear that Putin is all in. And when you see the eliminations of staff members and key allies, as well as advisors like this gentleman, then that's telling you that he's all in and that he wants to align himself with the hardliners. Basically, I think all of us are a little bit perplexed that this guy didn't fall out of a window yet, because that's usually how Putin treats anyone that disagrees with him. That may yet happen. That's a typical act. But definitely, from my perspective, Putin has just gone all in, as China is looking to go all in on the spoils of this war. I think the two are combined.
Also, Ukrainian army has conducted successful counteroffensives in the Sumy and Donetsk regions of Ukraine. Colonel Svit, what is your assessment of that, and could this lead to significant progress on the ground in Ukraine?
It could lead to progress, but right now Ukraine is fighting a defensive war on the ground, and I think what they're doing has been very successful to the point where they have stopped the counteroffensive. they're inflicting casualties. Again, as Mark said, Putin's not deterred by casualties, but just over the past 4 days, they've inflicted over 4,070 Russian casualties. So they're doing that well. And look, the defense of Ukraine is actually threefold. The first defense is Ukrainian version of sanctions, right? Targeting those facilities that are generating income. The other part, obviously, is defending their home terrain. There's a third part, which obviously is defending their skies. But equally as important, and we continue to stress this, is the interdiction part. It's that it's beyond a close fight. It's affecting Russia's ability to reinforce those ground forces. So while they're winning in the close fight, they can exploit that if they're able to successfully stop Russian forces from coming into Ukraine. That would give them more ability to counterattack and to seize more terrain. But until they stop the flow of Russian forces into their country, they're going to fight that fight every day.
Also, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that now the Ukrainian production of so-called long-range drones or missiles has reached a level where everything depends only on funding, on this war funding, on money, and on financial assets. What does this mean, Colin Sweet?
Look, Ukraine is, at last I saw, is producing over 50 Flamingo missiles a month. And that's incredible. And not to mention the sheer volume of drones that they're producing and that they're purchasing from their partners. So enabling Ukraine to build that capacity in Ukraine, and countries like Germany have opened up ammunition facilities for production, and other countries are supporting production at home station. I think Denmark is one of those countries. So it's critical to sustain the fight. And it's critical that Ukraine is using those weapon systems on key targets, and they're not using them on smaller targets, but rather larger targets. So to maintain the funding coming in, and what we've seen lately is funding that's being given to them by frozen assets. Right now, it's still a trickle of money, $3 to $5 million, but nonetheless, there are $350 million worth of assets, or euros worth of assets, that can be pushed to Ukraine to continue to enable them to manufacture their own weapons, to become less reliant upon Western type of weapons, which generally come with restrictions.
The EU is planning to create a so-called drone wall after Russian drones violated Polish and Romanian airspace, and also after Russian fighter jets MiG-31 entered in Estonian airspace. Mark, I have a question for you. How do you assess this project? Do you think it's more than a political signal, and why Slovakia and Hungary were absent from the first meeting of the drone wall countries?
Right. It's a great question, Sophia. And in my mind, it's got to be more than just rhetoric. It's too late in coming. This is something that Europe should have foreseen, a year ago, 2 years ago, that they needed to do a better defense. Clearly, one of the biggest dynamics to come out of this war is how much drones have become part of modern warfare. And in Europe's ability to protect itself, defend itself, needs to catch up and catch up fast. But it can't just be a defense of drones coming into NATO territory, or, as we saw, the 3 MiG-31s that encroached on Estonian airspace, carrying Kinzhal missiles, mind you, that can be nuclear capable, that were roaming for 12 minutes over that territory. It needs to be what John typically calls in the military something known as an active defense, where they're projecting out and interdicting these drones and fighter jets, if need be, before they even reach NATO territory. And one of the key ways of doing that would be with what Zelensky has called for, which is to work with Poland to be shooting these drones down over Ukraine. And ideally, I'd like to see that being even bigger, a NATO no-fly zone, or a coalition of the willing, if NATO's not willing, over Western Ukraine, to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, real quickly, why Fico and Orban were excluded? Basically, that's because they've been obstructive. They're viewed as basically pro-Putin, pro-Russia, and they're just not going to be beneficial in this regard. And I think it's a good sign because Europe gets it now. This is real. The threat is real. I know from different reports that I've seen and read and just media hits that I've done in Poland itself, the Polish people are very, very upset about this. They realize the war has now come to them. I think Estonia has always known that it would come to them. And so this drone wall has to be more than just a name. It's got to have real teeth.
Colonel Sweet, U.S. and Western intelligence agencies are divided whether the Russian drones intentionally violate Polish airspace, but all agree that Putin is acting more aggressively. From your military standpoint, is this a dangerous new phase, and how NATO should respond to it?
Sure. I don't think that the Western intelligence and the White House are the same sheet of music. We've heard Western intelligence state unequivocally that it was a provocative action, that 19 drones just didn't fly over Poland. 5 of those drones go into a NATO base that supplies Ukraine with their munitions. So there's a disagreement there. But no, it is a provocation. It is an intended to generate a response. As I said earlier, Putin's losing in Ukraine. At least he's losing the ground war, and he needs to mobilize, or partially mobilize, and he needs the support of the Russian people. So what he's trying to do is generate a reaction from NATO, saying NATO's a threat, NATO's an offensive threat, NATO's going to attack us. Therefore, we need to be prepared for a NATO invasion, and that would provide him justification to mobilize the country. They're already on a wartime economy. Now we're looking at the mobilization of forces, a possible mobilization of forces. So that's one of the things he's doing. Look, and I'll go back to what Mark just said. And this is probably beyond the helicopters that have crossed the border, beyond the drones. Those MiG-31s, it wasn't just a show of force. It wasn't just an intrusion. If they were carrying the Kizil weapon, as Mark said, a nuclear-capable weapon, that was more of a message saying that if you continue, we will consider the use of nuclear weapons. Okay, that's an escalation. NATO doesn't escalate. NATO rises to the escalation. Okay, Putin is intentionally trying to escalate to divert NATO's attention away from Ukraine, but also to garner support from the Russian citizens.
Colonel Sweet, I have additional question for you. Czech President Petr Pavel warned NATO could respond military, including shooting down Russian aircrafts, and later Radoslav Sikorski, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, also warned expect consequences if another missile or plane or drone enters its airspace. How credible are these warnings, and could NATO actually move from drones to shooting down Russian aircrafts?
Yeah, so you mentioned 2 of the 3. Okay, so you left out the United Kingdom, which yesterday also endorsed shooting down aircraft of any type that violate NATO airspace. So yes, 3 NATO countries saying that they would respond with kinetic force if their integrity is violated, and that's an important message. But it can't just be a message. Okay, it has to be followed through, and we know from Putin's experience that he is going to challenge that notion. He's going to challenge that, and he's going to at some point try to bring other aircraft over. It may not be fighter aircraft. It may be surveillance type of aircraft. It may be additional drones. It could be helicopters flying at low altitude. He will challenge it. If you're going to issue the decree, if you're going to draw the red line, you have to enforce it. And I saw earlier today that the Turkish President Erdogan has also said he thinks that NATO should be shooting down those aircraft. And he cites his example of Russia stopping their overflights when that aircraft was shot down back, I believe it was 2014. So you can flex your muscles, but you got to follow through. And right now, NATO's had a problem following through, as has the West.